Good morning. I think we should start because then we are in a tight time schedule. Again, I would like to welcome you in the name of the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute. And on the one side, I'm afraid when I'm being short again that you will think that the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute has nothing to say. On the other side, I'm afraid when I'm not going to be short, you're going to be bored. But just a short introduction on the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute. The Vienna Wiesenthal Institute does not continue the work of Simon Wiesenthal. We work in his spirit, and our task is to research the history of the Holocaust, the history of anti-Semitism, the history of racism, and the aftermath of the Holocaust, the memory of the Holocaust. The Institute was founded 4 years ago, and we are yet a very small institute, but I think we already have some successes. One of the successes is that we are just finishing the first round of our fellowship program. I think it was a success. 8 scholars from all over the world coming together in Vienna, researching on different topics in the area of the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute. And I think we already announced, or I'm sure we already announced the next round, and we are looking forward of continuing this program with the support of the City of Vienna and the Republic of Austria. The other one is a wide range of projects we are envisaging. For instance, we are just applying for a project on the history of anti-Semitism on different European universities in the interwar period, and we hope that it will pass through. And finally, we have a third line, which is the event line, when we try to gather scholars, an audience, and to inform them on different topics of Holocaust studies and the latest research. One of them is which is more or less becoming a brand of the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute, is the Simon Wiesenthal Lecture. About every 6 or 8 weeks, we come together on the same place where you have been yesterday, and the latest research results in the field of Holocaust studies, racism, or genocide studies are presented from different scholars of all over the world. There's another, which is also, I think, becoming a brand of the Institute. At the end of the year, we have a very large conference called the Simon Wiesenthal Conference, which is also in his spirit. And this time, it is going to be in collaboration with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, which in a way is a very honor for us, and we are very honored with that, because we are a very small institute, and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum still is kind of the flagship in this area. And we were going to have a common conference on complicity and collaboration in the Holocaust in the war period. And finally, in the middle of the year, we have this conference, which is a smaller conference, already also becoming a tradition. Last time we had a conference last year, Alma Mater's Antisemitica, which is kind of which was the preparation for this research project I was talking about. And this time we are cooperating with the Austrian Academy of Sciences, and we envisage this conference. Now, I'm not going to talk about this conference too much, because in the invitation letters you already got the idea. Together with Eleonore Lapin-Eppel, Heidemarie Uhl from the Austrian Academy of Sciences, and the research program director of the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute, Eva Kovac, and me, we kind of worked out the program. And I'm not really going to tire you in kind of bringing this program to you, because you already know about this program. So I hope that we are going to have 2 days of very intense discussions, debates, and I pass on the floor to our other host, Michael Rösner. Welcome. I'm sorry, I just have to tell that in the morning session, I'm going to chair the panel. Heidemarie Uhl is not here. She has an eye inflammation, and she cannot be here, so I'm going to be the chair. Okay.
Thank you. Good morning. A very warm welcome to you all in Vienna. I just want to tell you that the Austrian Academy of Sciences and its Institute of Cultural Studies and Theatre History are glad and proud to host your conference in cooperation with the Simon Wiesenthal Center. Our institute is also a small institute, but it is in place for almost 2 decades, and in these 2 decades we have in fact studied the ways how collective memory is being formed and how such memory is used to construct communities. During the last years, we concentrated on the three ways which seemed to us the most important ways for constructing and implementing such a collective memory. That is narration, performance, and translation, but translation between cultures, languages, religions, generations, and so on. On the other hand, the Academy as a whole has set as one of its main fields of investigation the conservation and analysis of cultural heritage, a concept which, as you all know, is widely used and seems to cover almost everything, from buildings to food, from music to games. One of the most recent inclusions in the UNESCO Cultural Heritage list is the Vienna type coffee house, which you will perhaps have the opportunity to visit during your stay in our city. But that means also that cultural heritage has become somehow globalized. We speak always of cultural heritage of mankind. And that was the reason why a year or so ago we have organized a roundtable in order to analyze this somehow vague concept. We have pointed out in this roundtable some aspects which seem also to apply to the use of the term of heritage in the title of this conference. Let me cite just one example. Heritage in the judicial sense is something you have a claim to, but you don't have it. You have to accept it actively. Nobody becomes an heir of something without such an act of willful acceptance. Why is this necessary? Obviously because heritage may be poisonous. There could be hidden debts which bear the risk of losses instead of gains. You as an heir could be held liable for something you didn't do, but the deviser did. And now you will surely understand what I'm aiming at. In this country especially, but perhaps in Europe as a whole, when we speak of cultural heritage, we have to conceive culture of the past as a whole. We have to accept it or refuse acceptance, but in this case again, such a refusal would be valid for the whole of our historical culture. So, one last reference to the field of law. Normally, the potential heir has the possibility to demand that an inventory of the estate be raised. What does that mean if we translate it into our sphere of culture studies? That we need to know as much as we can know about the elements of our cultural memory. That we have to analyze all these elements, even the poisonous ones, and then to decide acceptance. And if we do, such an acceptance has to be without disavowal and without repression. That's the reason why I think it is so important to talk about archives. And your work will contribute to this important goal. I'm glad that you are doing it here in Vienna, in our city rich of cultural heritage, but also of liabilities of the past. And I wish you very fruitful discussions. Thank you very much.
Okay. First panel, I think we should all sit in front at the beginning. Rochelle. Okay.
But then you have to go away.
Sorry. Sorry. Okay, as I told you, I'm sitting in for hi. Rochelle is okay. Quickly, she's coming. Just take your time, even though we're out of time. Okay, as I told you, I'm sitting in for Heidemar Ul with an eye inflammation. The first part of this morning is going to be moderated by me, the next one by Eleonore. In finding the titles of the different panels, I think we found a mixture between a chronological approach and a thematic approach. And the first panel we called Documenting Catastrophe and Rescue. basically, it's the first attempt to document catastrophe and rescue in different parts of the world on the Holocaust. First, I would like to welcome Jonathan Brent. Jonathan Brent is a historian, a publisher, and a writer, and as far as I see from his publication list, he's a specialist on the history of Stalinism also. In 2009, he became executive director and CEO of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research in New York. He has lectures especially, or he lectured especially on East European and Soviet history, and has numerous publications I will not list up now. These books are also translated. They are not translated into German as far as I see, but they are translated in French, Swedish, Spanish, Russian, Chinese, and even Polish. He changed his titles sometimes, so I announced the latest title. It's YIVO and the Politics of Knowledge, and I give you the floor. I'm going to be very strict on time, so you have exactly 30 minutes because we are then running out of time. Okay, please start.
Thank you very much. I want to pick up a little bit on the comments that were made last night by Tom Segev and talk a bit about YIVO and the politics of knowledge and the importance of politics in the collection of documents. When I was working in the Soviet archives with a very fine Russian historian on the subject of the doctor's plot, I asked him whether it would be possible for us to get to the bottom of the KGB on this subject. And he looked at me rather skeptically and he said, well, yes, of course, we'll get to the bottom of the KGB. And then he said, but the KGB has many bottoms. And in the world of scholarship, more is more. In the world of publishing, less is more. But the more you have, the more you have. And this was, to a certain extent, YIVO's philosophy from the beginning. But what was it that impelled this extraordinary collection effort on the part of YIVO? It didn't just happen out of thin air, the way a lichen forms on a tree. It was the tree itself. And the tree out of which YIVO came was the long and arduous history of Jewish intellectual maturity of the 19th century that led, on the one hand, to the Wissenschaft des Judentums in Germany, and on the other hand, to the assimilation and the secularization of Jews that seemed to develop out of that. And so there were two very powerful intellectual streams that came together in the formation of the YIVO Institute. One of them was this drive toward developing a methodology whereby Jewish history in Europe for the first time could be studied at all. And this, of course, had its roots in the German form of Enlightenment. But on the other, as opposed to what was perceived to be, and often was, the assimilationist trend of German secularization and the outcome of the Wissenschaft movement, the Hassskala in Germany, which was assimilation, in Eastern Europe, intellectuals like Dubnov and others were repelled by this fact. And Haskala, by the end of the 19th century, was declared dead. Why? Because it caused an abandonment of the roots of the Jewish people. And this, thinkers such as Dubnov and others would not tolerate. They did not wish it. They did not want it. And so at the very inception of of the YIVO Institute, Dubnov was one of the grandfathers, so to speak, of the YIVO Institute, comes a strong political motive, the motive of preserving the Jewish people through knowledge. It is not collecting of documents for their own sake. It is preserving the Jewish people through knowledge, which of course has biblical origins in the writings of the prophets. And indeed, by the end of the 19th century, in the 1890s, Dubnov and others were writing precisely about this. In his essay on Jewish history, Dubnov makes the point that what is essential for Jewish survival in Eastern Europe, but actually worldwide, is two things. One is the appropriation, self-appropriation of a historical consciousness. And he's very precise in his understanding of this word consciousness. It's a word that perhaps he takes from Hegel, but it's a word which in his writing gains a prominence that one finds only later in the writings of Sigmund Freud and also Edmund Husserl. And the Jewish preoccupation with consciousness is a very important component of Shimon Dubnov's nationalism. Why? Because in the essay on Jewish history, Dubnov writes that what is it that binds the Jews of Europe together? It is a shared historical consciousness. What is this consciousness? For him, it's a collection of many things. It is not simply Geist. It is many things. It is a religious tradition. It is a memory of the pogroms. It is a familial past full of anecdotes. It is folklore. And moreover, it is the Yiddish language. And so whereas Haskalah in Germany led to the abandonment of Yiddish and the embrace of German, one of the signal aspects of Dubnov's, what came to be called non-territorial Zionism, was precisely the embrace of Yiddish as a tool for binding this people together. But Dubnov was not interested simply in the Jewish people as a people. He was interested in the Jewish people as a nation. That is to say that the Jews of Europe constituted a nation without borders. It was a transnational nation. It had no flag, it had no parliament, it had no king, it had no Tower of London where we put our jewels on view, it had no Eiffel Tower, it had no pyramids, but it was a nation nonetheless. And the only means at the disposal of this people for constructing this nation was knowledge, whereby this historical consciousness that for Dubnov was really a sentiment, a feeling. And he is precise in this, in a way before Freud, which is most extraordinary and very, very intriguing to think about. Before Freud, he talks about the need to make these latent feelings of unity that Jews share among each other, their feelings, their memories, their this, their that, into self-consciousness. And the task of the effort at historiography that he was undertaking and others was therefore to turn consciousness into self-consciousness. And that became the task of the YIVO Institute, to make what we feel into what we know. Because it is only when we know what we feel that we can act. and that we can create the unity of purpose that he and others felt was necessary, and which, certainly after World War I with the Minorities Treaty, infused a great deal of hope and optimism into this effort. The point is that the YIVO Institute was born out of great hope. It was born out of the same emergence of nationalist energy that prevailed throughout most of Europe at the time in the building of new nations. And the Jews of Eastern Europe were intent precisely on doing this. Dubnov does not discount the importance of Palestine, not at all. And in his letters with his friend Ahad Ha'am, he writes about the fact that Palestine would be the spiritual center, but that of Judaism, but in fact the practical realities of the situation in Eastern Europe made it impossible for him and others to imagine transporting 5 million, 6 million people to Palestine under the British mandate. How is this going to happen? And so we have to live where we are. Going to America is a wonderful thing, Dubnov writes, and we should all go to America. But the fact of the matter is that as great as the migration, the emigration to America from Eastern Europe was, the basic population remained more or less the same. That what was going to America was really the overflow, but not the core of the Jewish people. And something had to be done in Europe itself to preserve that core, because it was also a core that had created some of the great culture of Europe. And this is also what he and others understood. It was a time of tremendous self-awakening of the Jewish people. And YIVO was going to capitalize on this. And understanding that they, through the effort of 1,000 years in Eastern Europe, had also built Europe itself. That on the one hand, it was a people unto itself, and on the other hand, it had contributed some of the most important elements to the communal development of European identity. And so this is where YIVO comes from. Connected to the concrete history of the end of the 19th century that in a way begins in 1881-82 with the pogroms and continues in 1903 with Kishinev and continues in 1905, and a sense of growing despair also. On the one hand, great optimism about the future, and on the other hand, a kind of overwhelming despair that, in fact, Europe is becoming a place where we cannot live, that we are being thrown out, that there is no future, which was becoming evident, especially in the wake of World War I and the Russian Revolution and the Civil War. You need only read Ansky's Destruction of Galicia in combination with the Dybbuk, his great play that he wrote at approximately the same time, to understand the mentality of so many of the thinkers of this time who see the Jew as hovering between two worlds, trapped. You see this in the paintings of Chagall. And in Isaac Babel's diary of 1920, as he goes through Ukraine. There's a passage when he gets to Dubno, and he finds himself in the center of the town, and he looks at the destroyed synagogues, and he looks at the destroyed marketplace, and he looks at the destroyed people, and he thinks about this destruction in 1920, and he writes in his diary, only one possessing a Jewish soul can understand what all this means. And then he writes, is this the century in which it perishes? And he wasn't thinking necessarily of the Holocaust at that point. He was just looking at what was in front of him. And if you can compare this, let us say, with the paintings, the drawings, the work of Bruno Scholz, you see also another response to this sense of some kind of impending emptiness, perhaps, is a way of putting it. In Scholz's drawings, you see, particularly the suite of drawings of Jews, he shows Jews at the long Passover table, some looking up, waiting for the Messiah or Eliyahu. And on the Passover table, there are dishes, and there's nothing on the plates. You see men and women sitting at a table at a coffee house, and there are dishes, but there's nothing on the dishes. There is no water in the cups. There is nothing for them to eat. There is no sustenance. And this is what so many were thinking. And so part of the job of and at the same time, thinkers like Dubnov and political activists like Ansky were aware that traditional Jewish life in the Städtlach was perhaps coming to an end. And so at the same time that this general nationalist movement is underway, which led also to a desire to protect the large Jewish communities, not just here and not just there, but in general, from pogroms and from the violence of their neighbors that was becoming intense, which of course is also in a way formalized by the Dreyfus trial on the one hand, and then the Béla trial on the other of 1913, in which Mendel Béla is accused of blood libel and tried in St. Petersburg. Eventually, he's found innocent. This is the 100th anniversary of that trial. But in light of all of this, Dubnov and Ansky initiated very wide-ranging collection efforts to preserve what they saw as perhaps disappearing forever. And it was partly because of these great expeditions that each of them launched that the YIVO Institute, when it was founded eventually in 1925, could have a model. These collection efforts were a paradigm, really, of what YIVO eventually undertook. And when it was founded in 1925, it was founded in Berlin, or that is to say, it was conceived in Berlin and then it was born in Vilna. But in Berlin in 1925, Russian émigré scholars came together, Jewish Russian émigré scholars came together with the idea of constructing the first Academy of the Jewish people. The purpose of this academy was to teach, to gather documents, and essentially to perpetuate the political the political initiatives of Szymon Dubnow. And so YIVO was born not just as a historical institute. It was born also with a desire to have contact with the people. It was born out of a desire to preserve the Jewish people. And consequently, it combined two things methodologically that were very important for its subsequent history. One of them was historiography, and the other was sociology. And one might ask, why was sociology such an important component of Jewish study? Why did sociology almost become a Jewish discipline at this time, actually? But it was a way to in fact, fuse the principles of objective history into an understanding of daily life. It brought Geist down to the level of what is going on in the kitchen. How do we pronounce this word? What is this bit of folklore here in the Ukraine? What is its counterpart in Belarus or in Lithuania or in Poland? Or God forbid, America. And so the sociological method that was really imported into and developed by people like Max Weinreich, who was among the founders of the YIVO Institute in Berlin, became essential to its collecting efforts as well. And so the YIVO Institute, between its founding in 1925 and its demise in Europe in 1941, amassed one of the largest archives of East European primary documentation in the world, perhaps the largest. We have now in New York City in our archives some 24 million documents. This is not pieces of paper, these are documents. And we have the largest collection of Yiddish language materials, I believe, in the world. We have, as far as I know, the only complete collection of Yiddish literature in the world, some 40,000 titles. And the reason for this is indeed because of the massive, the mania for collection that took place in the 20s and 30s, which made it possible, which in fact impelled people to collect everything. And so pamphlets, very, very ephemeral pamphlets in which a poem or a play or a novel appeared, a newspaper, these became documents in our archive. And because the effort was cut short in 1941, Vilna being in the Soviet sphere of influence after 1939, the war really did not begin until 1941. It made it possible for YIVO to collect things that otherwise disappeared forever. Why? Because Yiddish literature flowered very briefly, and there often was not time to collect things into published books. And it's precisely these pamphlets, these very, very delicate objects that contain so much of the literature, and which unfortunately perished virtually everywhere else. And why was it preserved? And this comes back to the politics of knowledge. It was preserved partly by Einsatzstab Rosenberg, which came to YIVO soon after the invasion and recognized the political significance of YIVO's materials. I would say recognized the political importance of these materials more perhaps than people recognize them today. Because in 1941, these materials still had a great political purpose, but the purpose now, the political purpose now, for the Nazis was that these materials would help them construct the Institute for the Study of Judaism, which would be, in effect, to memorialize now the extinct people of Europe. And so instead of helter-skelter destroying all of the YIVO materials, Einsatzstab Rosenberg, using slave laborers from the YIVO Institute, boxed up, wrapped up, and sent to Frankfurt, outside of Frankfurt, a great proportion of the YIVO archives, where it was discovered, where they were discovered after the war by the US Army, and they were then shipped after a long process to New York City. And this forms the core of the present archive of the YIVO Institute in New York City, these documents. However, a portion of the YIVO materials and library were not boxed up by Einsatzstab Rosenberg. Instead, through the efforts of what was called the Paper Brigade, led by Avram Sutzkever and Shmerke Kaczerginski and other YIVO workers, these materials were often hidden, given to Gentile friends, or hidden. They were brought from the YIVO building and hidden in the ghetto itself. And some of these materials were also found after the war and became what Kaczerginski and Sutzkever called the Vilna Museum of the Jewish People, that they were intent on rebuilding. But then, of course, the Soviets came in 1945, 46. All was well. They were supporting Yiddish culture, the blossoming of Yiddish culture. And then the State of Israel is formed. And when the State of Israel is formed in combination with the Cold War with the United States, and Jews are suddenly stigmatized as a possible fifth column, these documents assume yet another political meaning. And these documents now have the meaning in the Soviet sphere and for Stalin of a rallying point for Jewish nationalism. And therefore, the Soviets decide to eradicate the YIVO Institute, which is now the Vilna Museum of the Jewish People, and to destroy these materials a second time. The story is almost biblical, frankly, on how these materials survive. And so these materials, according to legend and according to what documents we have, were then taken by the Soviets and sent to a pulping mill in Vilna. And it was the efforts of a Lithuanian librarian, Antanas Ulpis, who saw what was going on, was horrified by this. He was not Jewish. And he organized an effort of his Jewish colleagues and non-Jewish colleagues to rescue the material. And through means that I myself do not completely understand, he was able to take the books, some perhaps 10,000 books, and to take the documents, perhaps 100,000 pages of material, from the pulping mill and store them in the basement of a church in Vilna, where they stayed from 1947, 1948, until 1989, when it was revealed to the world that the books still existed in the basement of that church. And it was not until the Soviet Union completely disappeared from view in 1991 that the documents were then revealed to exist. And we are now working with the Lithuanian government for the return in some form. Most likely the return will be digitally, of the materials that now are to be found in Lithuania. The materials are various. As one of our researchers, one of our archivists has said to me, who has looked at the material, he said, in New York we have one part of a correspondence, and the other part of the same correspondence is to be found in Vilna. But on a recent trip, I saw more than this. I saw books of handwritten plays. I saw material, much inter-office material concerning YIVO's activities and its behaviors. And we don't even know all that is in the boxes that remain unsorted in Vilna today. So that the process of reclaiming these materials for the Jewish people more broadly, the process of preserving these materials that was initiated in 1925 continues to the present day. I don't know how much time I have left, but I think I have nothing. Okay, perfect. YIVO never has anything. We always are out of time and out of money. But in the nothing that remains, let me just say that the result of YIVO's collection efforts and the politics that impelled it always led YIVO outside of the academy into the public sphere. And so the YIVO Institute was always interested in promoting teacher training, in promoting scholarship of young scholars, using its archival resources. But it went beyond that as well. The YIVO Institute promoted healthcare through various organizations. It was intent on on creating normative rules for Yiddish orthography, which led to endless political problems between the Litvish Yiddish, the Ukrainian Yiddish, all of the different kinds of Yiddish. And the result of this is what perhaps some of you have seen recently in the controversy, quasi-controversy, pseudo-controversy, crypto-controversy that erupted recently in America at a spelling bee that was won by a 13-year-old Indian boy, the son of immigrants, who was asked as his last question, how do you spell the word Kneidl? And he spelled it as Merriam-Webster suggested it should be spelled, K-N-A-I-D-E-L. Well, the New York Times got a hold of this, and they instantly recognized that something was wrong. And they said, no, wait a second. According to YIVO spelling, it should be K-N-E-Y-D-L. And out of this, if you go to Google and you type this in, you will find something like 50,000 postings in Urdu, in Pakistan, in India, in America, in Germany, in Russia. So the question of spelling, the question of creating a normative culture for Yiddish is something that still has effects even to this day. Briefly, YIVO was divided into 4 sections among 3 different cities: Warsaw, Berlin, and Vilna. Vilna became the center largely because it was also collecting folklore and collecting language, because essential for building the people, if Dubnov was correct, that Yiddish was the glue, so to speak, that held the people together. We had to know what this language was. And so I will end with an anecdote that I love. A great friend of mine is Benjamin Harshav at Yale University, who was one of the Sammlers for Max Weinreich. Sammler is a collector. They would go out and they would collect language. Well, his job was to collect obscenities, particularly obscenities hurled by women at children in the marketplace. And so he would go and he would torment. And he said to me that it was probably the mother of Chaim Grada he tormented most. He would torment these sellers of apples, often rotten apples, whatever they were, and nuts and so on and so forth, until they would start cursing at him. And then he would write down the curses and he would take them back to Max Weinreich. So one day he goes to the apple seller and he pulls her skirt and she shoos him away, and he yells and does something, and she yells at him, but none of the curses seem to him very interesting. And so he reaches for an apple and he runs away, and she shouts at him, "May your intestines turn into a telephone wire." And he wrote that down and brought it to Weinreich. And so I'll end there.
Okay, thank you. Of course, we're running out of time, but I was thrilled by the story so much that I gave you 5 or even more minutes. Our next speaker is Ben Barkow. He's the director of the Wiener Library in London since 2000, but his association with the Wiener Library began earlier in 1987. Before that, he held a post at the Wellcome Institute for the History of Medicine. His publications include publications on the ghetto in Theresienstadt, and I think one publication of which he's co-editor is also known by you. It's a small pocket book in the Fischer Verlag. It's the eyewitness reports on the November pogroms in Germany and Austria, or then also Germany, but Austria and Vienna in 1938. The title of his presentations is The Wiener Library, A Legacy of German Jewry.
Thank you very much. To understand the collection of the Wiener Library as constituting a legacy of German Jewry, we should start with the life of its founder, Dr. Alfred Wiener, who we see here as a young boy standing next to his father outside the family shop in the town of Benchen. Born in Potsdam in March 1885, Wiener showed a scholarly aptitude at an early age. He studied at the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums in Berlin, where he gained a grounding in a scholarly and academic approach to Judaism. And he also studied Oriental languages at the University of Berlin. He spent the years 1907 to 1909 in the Middle East, during which he became convinced that the Zionist project was misguided. After his return, he studied at the University of Heidelberg and completed a doctoral thesis on Al-Faraj Ba'ad al-Shida, Deliverance After Stress Islamic Poetry. He spent the years 1911 to 1914 as the private secretary to Paul Nathan, the leading Jewish anti-Zionist politician in Germany. This experience strengthened Wiener's views on Zionism while bringing him into renewed contact with Palestine, where Nathan set up numerous educational institutions. It also gave Wiener experience of combating anti-Semitism, because Nathan was involved in the defense of Jewish victims of blood libel, notably Menachem Mendel Baylis, who has already been referred to. After leaving Nathan, Wiener fought in the First World War, serving in the Middle East and in France, And in this photograph, he is the figure on the far right. Wiener joined the Zentralverein Deutscher Staatsbürger jüdischen Glaubens in 1919. His first publication also dates from this year. A pamphlet entitled Vor Pogromen, Tatsachen für Nachdenkliche. An analysis of anti-Semitic groups, their linkages and their financial supporters. While at the CV, he also spoke publicly on anti-Semitism, wrote for the CV Zeitung, and published further pamphlets. In 1926, the CV sent Wiener to Palestine to investigate the economic, social, and cultural progress of the Zionist enterprise. His report was published as Kritische Reise durch Palästina, Berlin 1927, which brought him sharp and personal attacks from Zionists, including Richard Lichtheim. In the immediate post-war period, the CV did not specifically identify the NSDAP as posing an extraordinary threat. Yet for Alfred Wiener, Hitler and the Nazis became the most pressing issue after 1925, the year Mein Kampf was published. But by 1928, the CV was prepared to respond, largely as a result of Wiener's arguments. It created the Büro Wilhelmstrasse, an agency that collected Nazi publications and materials and generated counter-propaganda against Nazi campaigns. Walter Giesling, seen here after the war in Israel, a journalist and member of the Republican paramilitary organization Reichsbanner Schwarz-Rot-Gold, was its archivist. In the period 1929 to 1933, he built up a collection of around 200,000 items, chiefly newspapers and reports of Nazi public gatherings. And the Büro Wilhelmstrasse produced leaflets, posters, and other propaganda materials for use in election campaigns, and also published a loose-leaf part work entitled Anti-Nazi Handbuch im Kampf gegen die NSDAP, Berlin 1932. This is the second edition, which has a slightly different subtitle. The Büro Wilhelmstrasse archive was closed and sent into hiding in 1933, but was lost or destroyed during the war. Alfred Wiener himself suffered a nervous collapse after the Nazi takeover and then planned his departure from Germany, and by the summer of 1933, he and his family were living in Amsterdam. So what I've described so far should, to some degree, locate Alfred Wiener in time and place and in a cultural and political context. What he did next after going into exile and what he ultimately bequeathed to us could have been done and left in the form that we have it by no one else. His legacy was, quite specifically, that of a German Jew, displaced from the homeland he had fought for and adored, and skeptical about Zionism. His Heimweh, which never left him, is poignantly, if not pathetically, captured in an anecdote related by an employee of the library during the 1950s, which tells of Dr. Wiener and Leonard Montefiore sitting in Wiener's office celebrating the Kaiser's birthday by drinking and singing patriotic songs late into the evening. In Amsterdam, Wiener wanted to continue the kind of work done by the Büro Wilhelmstrasse in Berlin. Interestingly, and despite his views about what was happening in Palestine, he chose to work with the Zionist David Cohen, professor of ancient history at Amsterdam University, and at the time a leading figure in the efforts to assist Jewish refugees fleeing Germany, later, of course, a controversial figure as the head of the Judenrat. Starting in August 1933, the two men planned a new organization, eventually called the Jewish Central Information Office, JCIO. In October 1933, Cohen attended a conference in London at which a resolution was passed calling for a, quote, central bureau to collect information with respect to Nazi propaganda and to disseminate information thereon. And in this photograph, we see the first office of the JCIO in the south of Amsterdam in Jan van Eyckstraat. It was the first floor flat there, and Wiener and his family occupied the ground floor flat. Wiener used and extended his network of contacts to secure a supply of interesting materials from Germany. These included not only the daily newspapers, but also regional and local papers, trade and professional journals, as well as books, pamphlets, photographs, and personal reports. Starting in the summer of 1934, the JCIO began to issue publications. A periodical entitled Die Jüdische Informationszentrale ran from July 1934 to April 1935, 8 issues in total. These focused on short reports, mostly summaries from press articles, books, posters, leaflets which the office had collected and which revealed something of significance about Nazi Germany. The JCIO also issued a large number of mimeographed reports on a wide range of topics, from the general, 6 Years of Hitler, 1939, to the specific, Brief aus Shanghai, also 1939. And an internal report of the JCIO claims that around 1,200 such reports were issued, and if that's true, then several hundred have proved untraceable. During the period in Amsterdam, the JCIO engaged with 3 issues intensively. The first was the trial in Bern, Switzerland, of the publishers of an edition of the notorious anti-Semitic libel, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Wiener had long been interested in the protocols and assisted the prosecution with materials proving the forgery, and also he attended the trial. The second special focus of these years arose out of the murder of Wilhelm Gustloff, the leader of the Swiss Nazis, by the Jewish student David Frankfurter in February 1936, an incident which sparked an international furore. The JCIO responded by compiling an extensive volume detailing anti-Jewish measures implemented by the regime since coming to power. Here is Alfred Wiener and his staff, Wiener on the left, and on the far left his wife Margarete Saulmann, out for a social occasion. An extensive volume detailing anti-Jewish measures implemented by the regime since coming to power, and which formed the context and background of Frankfurter's act. It was entitled Dokumentensammlung über die Entrechtung, Ächtung und Vernichtung der Juden seit der Regierung Adolf Hitler. The Dokumentensammlung is arranged into 8 sections with 2 appendices. The first demonstrates the fundal anti-Semitism of the Nazi Party by extracting quotations from the party program, from Mein Kampf, and from writings and speeches of other Nazi leaders. The second covers the destruction of the professional and economic existence of the Jews and details the general economic situation, individual professions, the financial losses incurred through emigration, and the barring of the possibility of re-immigration. The third section describes measures designed to prescribe Jewish life and to ostracize the community, and includes material on Rassenschande and economic boycott. The fourth section details the denigration of God, the Bible, and Jewish religious life. Interesting for the Nazi attack on Roman Catholic nuns in the same breath as good time girls who consort with Jews, both of whom are dem Volke verloren. The fifth section describes efforts to dishonor the Jewish fallen and veterans of the First World War, a subject that Wiener had focused on even in the 1920s. And the sixth section documents the impact on of Nazi policy on Jewish children and the representation of Jewish children in the press, in school books, and in children's literature. And an illustration from that section shows a picture of a Jewish orphanage which was closed down and the children expelled at a few hours' notice. and so on. I won't go through all the sections. At the same time, the JCIO published a volume entitled Photographische Dokumentensammlung, etc., etc. And here's the title page and a couple of examples from the inside. Pictures of boycott and a famous Nazi quotation painted on a wall in Nuremberg. The third issue to which the JCIO devoted a special effort was the so-called Kristallnacht of November 1938. Although publishing relatively little, the JCIO assembled a remarkable collection of around 350 first-hand accounts of the pogrom across Germany and Austria, the majority written in the days and weeks following the events. The collection is blandly entitled Private Reports on Jews in Germany 1938 to 1939. And these accounts cover the following topics: the wave of arrests in June 1938, the events leading up to the pogrom, the destruction of synagogues, reactions from abroad, deaths during the pogrom, Berlin and other numerous towns, districts and Länder, concentration camps after the pogrom, the rescue of children, including material about Kindertransport, the pogrom in Austria and the pogrom in Moravia and Bohemia. And there's a great immediacy and spontaneity in these accounts, which lends them a powerful emotional force, in addition to their remarkable factual detail. And one example of this will have to suffice. Document B86, a description of events in the towns of Hilden and Düsseldorf. And I'll translate the first paragraph. In Hilden, a man almost 60 years old was stabbed during the night of 9th to 10th of November, as were 6 other Jews, of whom 4 died and 2 survived. The daughter-in-law was summoned and asked whether her father-in-law was in the habit of attempting suicide. Then she was asked, had she seen who did it? She replied, "For the record, I don't know if it was an SS or an SA man or a private person, but I can say to you unofficially that it was my neighbor, the hairdresser." Following the pogrom, Alfred Wiener decided that his collections should be transferred to London, and this followed in the summer of 1939, although an office remained in Amsterdam, which was hastily closed down following the German invasion in May 1940. By the time the JCIO left Amsterdam, it had a collection of around 8,000 books, dozens or hundreds of periodical titles, a photographic collection, and outstanding collections of press cuttings arranged thematically. The staff numbered 17. The collections arrived in London, as I said, in the summer of '39 and occupied these offices in Manchester Square. Throughout the war, the JCIO, which became known firstly as Dr. Wiener's Library and later as the Wiener Library, was used primarily by the British government as its most comprehensive source of background intelligence on Nazi Germany, and in addition, a significant number of Jewish organizations around the world subscribed to its publications. Wiener himself spent part of the war in the USA, where he established networks to ensure that the library could receive regular shipments of books and other materials from Germany and occupied territories. Throughout the war, the JCIO, here's Alfred Wiener in his office in Manchester Square. And then throughout the war, the JCIO issued a regular periodical, The Nazis at War, and from January 1942, a second periodical, Jewish News. And the latter seems to have been a deliberate response to the fact that the British authorities did not acknowledge the Jewish identity of Wiener's collections and had little interest in the fate of the European Jews. Both periodicals comprised selected quotations from publications, speeches, and agency reports that reflect important aspects of military and political developments. Thus, for instance, 3 weeks after the Wannsee Conference, Jewish News carried an item from the Jewish Telegraphic Agency highlighting the enormous mortality rate in the camp at Oswiecim, which is, I think, an important note in view of the central role assigned to Auschwitz in the so-called final solution after the conference. Immediately after the war, the JCIO published 6 Holocaust survivor accounts under the title Jewish Survivor Reports, Documents of Nazi Guilt. At the same time, it was compiling information for the United Nations War Crimes Commission, the British War Crimes Executive, and the US Chief of Counsel. And this kind of documentation was of importance to the prosecutors at the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, and the library was rewarded for its work with a set of trial documents relating to the murder of the Jews. In 1946, it began publication of the Wiener Library Bulletin, which continued into the 1980s and played an important role in promoting and fostering scholarly study of the Nazi era and the Holocaust. During the second half of the 1950s, by which time the library was occupying this building, number 4 Devonshire Street. It was there from 1957 until the summer of 2011, so it's been its longest home. The library collected around 1,200 eyewitness accounts of the Holocaust. The project was led by Eva Reichmann, the library's director of research, and remains a collection of unusual value, having been formed so close to the events that they predate the use of the word Holocaust to describe the murder of the Jews. The accounts range in length from a few pages up to about 150 pages, and the collection was supported financially by the Claims Conference. The project was announced and begun in 1954, and by the end of the following year, some 250 accounts had been collected. In 1955, the project began to carry out interviews in mainland Europe. The formal name of the collection is the P Scheme, consisting of personal reports, eyewitness reports, and documents of Nazi persecution. And the broad subjects covered are history up to 1933, from the seizure of power to the outbreak of war, the final solution, and the fate of survivors. And as you can see, each of these sections is broken down into several subsections. And each report has a summary sheet, and here we see one example concerning a report by Dr. Bruno May about a curious episode known as the Guatemala transfer, by which a number of elderly Jews were able to escape Germany as late as the summer of 1944 by buying shares in a Guatemalan shoe factory. And finally, there's the document to which the summary sheet refers. Perhaps the most striking thing about the eyewitness accounts is the great variety of narrative styles they contain, from the self-consciously literary to, odd as it may seem, the humorous. And I suppose that these different styles of narrative are psychological strategies for coping with raw, very painful material. And it should also be mentioned that in contrast to survivor accounts written in the last 10 or 15 years, few of these have a triumphal mood. The timing of these accounts largely predates successful careers, happy marriages, children, grandchildren, and so forth. One, for instance, is very stark indeed. An elderly survivor has lost contact with all family and friends, is living in poverty in a bedsit flat in central London, and wonders forlornly what the future holds for him. And I think his voice and those of other so-called unsuccessful survivors seem rather forgotten now. Alfred Wiener died in 1964 and was replaced a year later by Walter Laqueur, under whose leadership the library broadened its remit to include the study of contemporary history. Together with George Mosser, Laqueur founded the Journal of Contemporary History, which continues to the present time, although is not associated with the library anymore. And also under Walter's leadership, the library's reputation as a center of academic excellence peaked. But in the 1970s, it was gradually overwhelmed by financial difficulties. And in 1980, a large part of the collection was transferred to Tel Aviv University, where a Wiener library continues to this day. The original library struggled for existence in the 1980s, but was ultimately successful in re-establishing the quality of its collections and work. Walter Lecoeur stepped down in 1992 and was succeeded by David Cesarani, who was director until 2000 when I took over. So today, the library serves as Britain's Holocaust library and archive and is a contributor to Holocaust education and commemoration both nationally and internationally. And I'd say that while the library remains fully conscious of its origins in German Jewry, it has, of necessity, moved beyond its legacy. In terms of our collections of books, two examples illustrate this. In 2009, we decided to extend our collections of our collection remit to take on questions relating to post-Holocaust genocides, and most particularly to the question of comparison. While this is a departure, it still remains true to the values of Alfred Wiener, because he was never narrowly interested in Jewish victims of persecution, and in the 1950s and 60s was very active in drawing attention to the prejudice and violence perpetrated on black immigrants to Britain. He felt that after the Holocaust, Jews have a special responsibility to speak out against racial hatred of whatever kind. But even within the original collecting remit, i.e. about the Holocaust, we strive to expand the coverage of our library. So historically, we have been strongest in material about German-speaking Jewry, but we have worked hard for many years to improve the coverage on Eastern Europe and beyond. And for instance, last year we're able to take over a large collection of books and pamphlets from Professor Antoni Polonsky about Polish and Russian Jewry. In 2009, the library carried out a small project to film in-depth interviews with women who came to the UK as child refugees after the war. Many came as members of the group that has come to be known as the Boys. We met one of these women quite by chance and were impressed by the way she spoke of her long-standing irritation as always being called a boy. With her assistance, we met a number of other women from this group and carried out our interviews. Thematically, these interviews focus on memory and specifically the absence of it, because most were very young when they lost their families, the youngest having been born in Mauthausen during the week of its liberation. Their stories are of lifelong searching for traces of their own identities, often obliterated by their adoptive parents, and are the more poignant because many of these women present and have the speech patterns typical of elderly middle-class English women, which somehow makes the content of what they describe more shocking. The library now receives some document collections in digital form. We prefer paper, but we take what we can get. One exception is the digital copy of the 100 million document collection of the International Tracing Service, which the British government asked us last year to host. And this is one of the largest and least known archives relevant to the Holocaust, and its acquisition is having a major impact on our ability to contribute to international work of Holocaust remembrance and research. And in conclusion, I want to consider the question of the library's impact on Jewish identity today. So the question, of course, is which Jewish identity? For the refugees and their descendants, the library is indispensable, both as a resource and as a monument to their sufferings and achievements. By contrast, the average British Jew, mostly descendants of 19th century East European immigrants, they largely do not identify with the library and have little interest in it. For very many British Jews, the Holocaust is a painful, frightening, and even embarrassing topic that's best avoided. Typical was the response of one wealthy individual, "Why should I support you? That's for the Germans to do." Another example, the Leo Beck College, the seminary for Reform rabbis, has consistently declined our invitations to include even a short visit to or from the library as part of the training for rabbis. The students, we're told, are too busy to engage with this. The Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox communities are interesting. Traditionally remaining distant, there have been signs in recent years of a slow and tentative opening up and a realization that some form of engagement with the subject is necessary for the younger generation. Where such tentative contact might lead is still unclear. However, the library's frequently been visited by individuals from these communities, sometimes for a one-off visit, sometimes for long research of months. For non-Jewish audiences, the library is the UK's major source for printed and archival material on the subject. Students in particular base themselves with us during their studies. And for general audiences, our rolling programs of exhibitions and the large and varied program of public events are attractive. For scholars, the library has not been that important because its archival holdings are small and not really focused on the main themes of interest to academics today. But now, as the repository of the digital copy of ITS, this is beginning to change, and already many British universities want to work with this material, and we're actively engaged in cooperation with USHMM and Yad Vashem on ITS-related issues. In terms of Europe, our participation in the European Holocaust research infrastructure means that we're better integrated into the network of Holocaust research and commemorative institutions than we have been for decades. And finally, we remain, as far as I'm aware, thanks to the British love of laissez-faire, the only major Holocaust institute in Europe that receives no financial support from its own government. Thank you.
Thank you, especially for the time discipline. Perfect. Our final speaker in this block is Rochelle Rubinstein from the Central Zionist Archives in Jerusalem. She has studied history in Jerusalem at the Hebrew University, held another degree from the same university, and also has taught at this university at the School for Library Information and Archival Sciences in Jerusalem. And the title of her lecture is Holocaust-related material in the Central Zionist Archives. Thank you.
Shalom, hello. Strange as it may seem, given the noise that the small state of Israel makes these days in the news, 100 years ago, of course, there was no Israel as we know it. There was hardly even a Zionist movement. The notion of the Jewish people gathering to live in the Holy Land, in Palestine that is, was new and had begun taking shape in the 1880s when in the 1890s when the World Zionist Organization was formed. The World Zionist Organization, note that. Thereafter, a number of additional Zionist bodies were formed, mainly, of course, the Jewish Agency, take note of that, a quasi-government which was founded later on. What is important to note in order to understand the archival situation in Israel is that when the State of Israel was formed in 1948, many departments of the World Zionist Organization and the Jewish Agency continued to function alongside the various state bodies. We see here a very brief outline of the formation of the bodies of the Zionist organization, but bear in mind that we have separate archives for the material of the Zionist Organization and the Jewish Agency, and then there is the state archives, the Israel State Archives. I must say that to their credit, very early on, the Zionist movement set up an archive. In 1919, the CZA was founded in Berlin, 1919, that is the very beginning of the Zionist movement. With the Nazi rise to power, the material, 154 boxes in all, were shipped to Palestine, that's in 1933. It became the prominent archives of Jewish Palestine and began the task of the tracing and bringing to Israel of personal and institutional archives that had survived the destruction in Europe. The amount of material increased, and by the 1980s, the holdings of the archives were kept in 8 different storage spaces around Jerusalem. This state of affairs prompted the JA and the Zionist organization, the Jewish Agency and the World Zionist Organization, to construct a special building. And you can see pictures here. Since 1987, the CZA is housed in a specially designed archival building at the entrance to Jerusalem. There's talk, by the way, now of expansion and building of the area around the archives at the entrance to Jerusalem. So in 10 years' time, I hope that I'll be able to describe the Zionist archives differently, and there'll be another set of pictures. So, I want to clarify the situation. Please note that the CZA holds the material of the Zionist movement, that is, the body set up to run the affairs of pre-state Jewish Palestine, and which continues to function till today, while the Israel State Archives, as I said, continues to exist. And of course, there's Yad Vashem, the Holocaust archives as well. In addition to the World Zionist Organization, the Jewish Agency, the CZA holds the archival material of the Jewish National Fund, Keren Kayemet, for those of you who understand, a body set up to run the purchasing, reclaiming, and development of the land, and also the archives of the Foundation Fund, Keren HaYesod, and various other bodies. In addition, in the 1970s, the Zionist archives became the repository of the World Jewish Congress, something which we talked about yesterday evening, and there are a slide or two that I'll show you later on. We hold the archives of a number of the offices of the World Jewish Congress, which is a body not connected to the Zionist organization or the Jewish Agency. In addition to all of that, the archives also has about 1,500 private papers. That is the archival material of people who were involved in Zionist activity throughout the years or in the upbuilding of Palestine in one way or another. All in all, we hold about 10 kilometers of files. We like to throw out 80 million documents, but you guys are invited to come and count. We also have a photograph collection. That's the record groups and personal papers. We have genealogical collections, which I'll talk about later on. We have an enormous photograph collection of something like 1 million photographs. Maps and settlements plan collection, the posters and handbills collection, a library, newspaper collection, an audio collection, artifacts, a very small artifacts collection, and microfilm from the early times when we still acquired microfilm material that we couldn't get the originals of. I should add that I doubt if I'll be able to provide more than a very cursory look at all the material with the limited time at my disposal. I'm sorry about this. You're invited to check the website, to browse the website, and of course send us emails and questions and so on. I do just for one moment want to digress about the whole question of digitization. It's occupied me and us for the last 10 years in such a way. It's been the main direction of some of the work that we've been doing over the last few years. Of course, the transferring of the database to electronic form, the database, was the first project, and as of now, the database includes millions of items, most of them on the file level. We don't register and catalog so much on the document level, on the file level. That is the description of the file contents. And then we began the scanning of the material, and we've scanned in all something like 12 million pages of the various files. We've also typed in and scanned almost all of the photograph collection and the maps collection and the poster collection. You'll see some of the results in the presentation, of course. And then, of course, there's internet. The computerized database is available on our website. You can query the database and even see thumbnail-size renditions of the photographs and the posters, though not of the documents. You cannot as yet see the thumbnail version of the documents. But the public is invited to contact us, and we can send scans by email and by other means. As for the changes this has caused, well, yes, the public wants the material easily available and online. But whether it has changed the directions of research, I'm not so sure. Yes, internet has made everything available. Anyone can know everything about anything, and that's very good. But has it actually changed the nature of research? I'm not so sure, I don't think so. To get to the truth of what actually happened in Europe during the war, one still has to piece together the individual stories, item after item, consider the big picture, and connect that big picture with the next big picture. In this presentation, I'll display some of the material at the CZA, item after item. I will leave the big picture and its connection to the next big picture to you guys and to the historians. Okay, with regard specifically to Holocaust-related material. The material relates to the response of the Jewish settlement in Palestine to the goings-on in Europe before, during, and after the Second World War. Okay? Here, for instance, is a partial list from the files of the political department of the Jewish Agency dealing with Romania. These files deal with Romania. The political department, by the way, was set up to run, obviously, the political aspects of the Jewish Agency, and it's the main department with regard to an enormous range of issues, including the Holocaust. You'll note, of course, that it's in Hebrew. I'm sorry about this. About 80% of our lists are in Hebrew. The actual material is in a variety of languages, of course, depending on the country that the document was born in and so on. But I do want to point out that there is much material on the situation in the local communities, both on the city and on the regional level, material which allows for serious research of local histories, which is an important trend in Holocaust research today. In other words, if somebody orders one of these files on Romania and pages through them, he will definitely find material on the local level of the various villages, towns, and cities in Romania. Without a doubt, although the title is Romania, the documents are about the various communities, the correspondence with the Jewish Agency about the various communities. This is the file level, and there are tens of thousands of file descriptions of different natures. And here we're on the document level. I just chose one document out of the many to show to you. German refugees in India, of all places, one document from the political department of the Jewish Agency. Okay. One of the responses to the worsening situation in Europe in the 1930s was, of course, the rising number of Jews who decided to immigrate, and to Palestine at that. The correspondence regarding immigration is to be found at the CZA, mainly in the immigration department files of the Jewish Agency. I realize that this is somewhat peripheral, perhaps, to the core issue of the horrendous situation of the Jews in Europe, but it is one of the prime responses to the worsening situation. Please note that the photographs are from the photograph collection at the archives. I will say in brackets, we do not have a lot of photographs of what was going on in Europe for obvious reasons. So a lot of the photographs that I'm going to show you are going to be what's happening in Palestine as a response to what's happening in Europe. Once again, a list of files of the Youth Immigration Department. Concurrent with the worsening of the situation, the Youth Immigration Department of the Jewish Agency was set up. Its aim was to arrange the immigration of youth to Palestine and their absorption without their parents in Palestine. Under Henrietta Soul's stewardship, the department aided in bringing to Palestine tens of thousands of children and settled them on various kibbutzim and other agricultural settlements in Palestine. The thousands of files of the department are kept at the CZA, and I'll come back to the personal files and the personal card catalogue that we hold with regard to Aliyat Noir, the youth immigration, later on. And here are some photographs from our photograph collection showing the youth Aliyah camp at Lindenfeld near Munich. This is quite exceptional, this picture, because it's a picture of Europe. It's the camp at Lindenberg, where the youth were transferred to Marseille and their immigration to Israel began. This is all at the end of 1948. Also in the 1930s, the Jewish Agency set up the Central Office for the Settlement of German Jewry, which, as its name implies, sought to aid the settlement of the growing number of mainly German Jews who were seeking to leave Europe and settle in Palestine. The material includes correspondence files on the immigration and absorption of the Yekim, the German Jews, in Palestine. Another aspect that is covered in the material is the attempt of the Anglo-Palestine Bank under the directive of the Jewish Agency and the economic authorities of Nazi Germany, which ultimately allowed for the emigration of another 60,000 German Jews to Palestine, to implement a system whereby the Jewish immigrants would give up most of their possessions to Germany before departing. Those assets would later be obtained by transferring them to Palestine as German export goods. The Havara Agreement officially remained in existence until September 1939 and did its bit in helping some German Jews to immigrate. What we have here is a list of files of the Havara Record Group. In 1940, the Jewish Agency's Haifa Investigation Bureau began gathering in cooperation with the British military authorities information on the situation in Europe. Part of this information came from new immigrants who had managed to escape Nazi-occupied Europe and reach Palestine. The files of the Bureau can be found in the CZA and actually are quite unbelievable in the extent to which they portray the situation in Europe. Here, for instance, is a document regarding German troop movements and the whereabouts of German barracks in Yugoslavia in December 1941. And on the right, there's even a sketch of the German garrison command in Sarajevo. Okay, so there's a lot of very military material, reports of the military situation, and of course also reports on the general situation in the various countries of Europe. As for the planned annihilation of European Jewry, British intelligence, of course, had learnt of 10 death camps, including Auschwitz, as early as the spring of 1942. In Palestine, the turning point came with the arrival later in the year to Palestine of 69 Palestinian Jews who had been held in Europe by the war and exchanged for German nationals residing in Palestine. Eliyahu Dobkin spent 2 days questioning these people, including the children in the group, and came to the conclusion that the Jews of Europe were being systematically wiped out. All this appeared in his report to the Jewish Agency Executive of November the 22nd. And that is the protocol of the meeting. This was the first time that the official ruling body of the Jewish settlement in Palestine publicly discussed information regarding what was becoming recognized only then as the systematic annihilation of the Jews. Okay? The next day, the Jewish Agency Executive issued a press release, and the National Council, the Vada Leumi, the council governing the Jews of Palestine, the local government of the Jews of Palestine, announced a 3-day work stoppage and mourning period. Here are posters from our poster collection announcing the 3-day mourning period. Okay? All of it in Hebrew, of course, for obvious reasons. In January 1943, and as a result, of course, of the reports that were coming from Europe, the Rescue Committee of the Jewish Agency was set up with the specific aim of rescuing Jews from Europe. 1943, a committee set up to rescue Jews from Europe. At its head stood Yitzhak Greenbaum. The archive of the Rescue Committee held at the CZA contains reports on the situation of the Jews in Nazi-occupied Europe, in Poland, Hungary, Romania, and so on, material on assistance to children and youth, fundraising appeals, secret reports from Nazi-occupied territories in Europe, material on the activities of various rescue and aid committees, testimonies regarding Jewish underground resistance, the situation of Jewish refugees after the Holocaust as well, and so on and so on. Here is a list, once again, I'm sorry, in Hebrew, of a tiny amount of the files in proportion to all the files that there are. This, perhaps, is the core Holocaust-related material that we hold at the Central Zionist Archives. Here is a document, a report from Buchenwald, okay, which you guys can read better than I can. And then a rather pitiful letter from Lonek Friedman to Yitzhak Greenbaum describing his destitute situation and the destruction of his family. Exactly how this particular document landed up in the files of the Rescue Department of the Jewish Agency, that in itself is a interesting little research. All right, systematic illegal immigration began in the 1930s in response to the steadily worsening situation in Europe. During World War II, the Aliyah Bet, the illegal immigration body, became a primary means for rescuing Jews from the Nazis. From 1933 to 1948, about 114,000 Jews arrived to Palestine illegally, and many were interned in Atlit in Palestine or in Cyprus instead of being allowed to get to Palestine. At any rate, though, they did escape the horrors of Europe. And here are some photographs, once again, from our photograph collection of the arrival in Palestine of illegal immigrants. Enlistment to the British Army and the Jewish Brigade, once again, perhaps a slightly peripheral issue, but nonetheless well reflected in the material that we hold. About 30,000 Palestinian Jews volunteered for service in the British Army. Many of them were, by the way, women, and you'll see that is reflected actually in the graphic material that I'll show you in a minute. In addition, in September 1944, the British established the Independent Jewish Brigade, which saw service in Italy and later participated in post-war Allied occupation in Germany, Austria, and Italy. There were about 5,000 soldiers in the Jewish Brigade group, which was, as I said, founded in 1944. And there is quite a lot of material at the archives on this whole issue. Here are some of the examples of the graphic material in the poster collection. What I like about this poster is, I should have actually shown it, that poster in the right-hand corner of the women registering for service. We actually have the poster, I should have put it next to the photograph, sort of archival, current use of archival material. At any rate, these posters, there are a lot of these kinds of posters in the poster collection. After the war, the Jewish Agency sent representatives to the displaced persons camps in Europe, who were active in aiding the survivors and promoting immigration to Palestine. This material is contained in the emissaries section, Medora Shlichim in Hebrew, it comes out more understandable. The emissaries section of the Jewish Agency contains correspondence with the various emissionaries, I don't know that word, that were sent to Europe to aid the survivors and direct them to Palestine. As for the post-war period and the concentrated effort to bring Nazi perpetrators to trial, here are some documents illustrating the Jewish Agency's part. There is an enormous amount of material. This is really a tiny amount. Here, for instance, is a report of the visit of Ben-Gurion to camps in Germany after the war. You wanted to know if we had material on Ben-Gurion, Tom, as we do here and there. And here we have a list of war criminals. As you can see, there is even a form. This was a large-scale activity that the Palestine Jews were helping with the question of collecting material on Jewish war criminals after the war. As I said earlier on, the World Jewish Congress is another source of material. It was founded in Geneva in August 1936 as an international federation of Jewish communities and organizations. It is not part of the Jewish Agency, the World Zionist Organization, and so on. But in the 1980s, the Zionist archives signed an agreement and became the official archives of the World Jewish Congress as well. And what we have is the material of the Geneva, Stockholm, London, and Jerusalem, of course, branches of the World Jewish Congress. Of course, I don't have to tell you how important the World Jewish Congress was in this whole episode, the whole period of the Holocaust. The material that we hold is extensive, really. It's an enormous amount of material. Lucky for you guys, it's catalogued in English, so you can actually read the file titles. Yeah, correspondence with regard to Belgium and to all the countries of Europe. And the private papers. For obvious reasons, the Zionist Archives does not hold material of individual people who went through the Holocaust in Europe. While the CZA did manage to transfer to Europe much relevant archival material after the war, this was institutional material of the Zionist bodies active before the war period and not the private papers so much of Zionist functionaries. There is really only a small amount of papers of people active in passing active in assisting the Jews of Europe when recording their plight. For instance, the archives of Shalom Adler-Rudel, Fritz Ullmann, and Eva Michaelis Stern, who was very involved in Youth Aliyah matters in particular. In those archives, there are a considerable amount of material. Of course, in the papers of the various Zionist functionaries, for instance, the papers of Moshe Sharet, there is certainly material complementing the institutional material and relating to the issues of the times. You can see here, as an example of material from private papers, a card index with names and addresses of people in various countries occupied by Germany from the archives of Fritz Ullmann. And the letter or the written document is an account of Eva Michaelis Stern of her interrogation by Adolf Eichmann in 1937, at that time the head of the Jewish department in the Nazi Secret Service apparatus. You can read the full document on our website. We put it up and wrote a whole article about it. We felt that it was, it deserved that much attention. All right, on to another general topic. This is another aspect of the material that we hold. For the last decade or so, the Central Zionist Archives has put considerable emphasis on the topic of family research. And in these years, we've received huge amounts of genealogical material. Once again, most of it, the various departments of the Jewish Agency and the World Zionist Organization, most of it connected, once again, to the Jewish Agency and the World Zionist Organization. In response to the times, the archives established a family research section, and the public is invited to send requests for information, and, albeit for payment, the CZA staff will carry out a search for relevant information. It seems that despite the fact that decades have gone by, there is no dwindling of the amount of interest in locating information about family members who perished, or to locate the traces of those who did, but to trace their path. That's with regard to the Central Zionist Archives setting up a family research section. Just to go back for a minute to the history, after the war in 1946, the Jewish Agency set up a family research department in order to handle the ever-growing number of requests flowing in from all over the world, asking for information about relatives or friends with whom contact had been lost. Until it was closed in 1999, the department processed hundreds of thousands of applications from all over the world. For each application, data was collected in the form of a card catalogue and in many cases also in the form of a personal file about that particular person. This material was all transferred to the CZA, and it is the basis of our family research section. Here, what I've shown here is a list on the record group level. Each of these contains thousands of files or card catalogues, as you can see from the high numbers in the second column. Each of these are record groups or funds of genealogical material. In other words, a series of personal files or a card catalogue or a list of immigrants, for instance. A vast amount of material, okay? We hold, for instance, the lists of immigrants from 1919 to 1970, which can be a part of a family's quest to work out what happened to its various members. We have a card index and the personal files of candidates for immigration as well. Candidates for immigration and immigrants. Once again, there are an enormous amount of candidates for immigration who didn't immigrate because they perished in the Holocaust. So this again is an enormously important source for tracing people who went through those years. Here we have a slide of some of the material that we have. On the bottom left-hand corner, a card catalogue of a card of an immigrant, and then the pictures of the drawers themselves. Really vast amounts of material. The material has been digitized. The cards themselves are digitized. The lists are computerized. And until we get to the level of the personal file itself, we're working with a computer. The personal files, of course, we didn't scan, and we still work in the old ways. Youth immigration is another important aspect. Once again, lists, card catalogues, and an enormous amount of personal files of the children that did manage to get to Palestine. Also, again, lists and personal files of the people who enlisted into the British Army, yeah? Recruitment and demobilization, a lot of material related to the recruitment and to the demobilization of the various soldiers. All of this whole genealogical family research thing is a big and very time-consuming topic of the Zionist archives, but I think of increasing importance. I do want to just point out that there is a new, or it's not very new, but there is a major direction of genealogical research which has opened up over the last few years, and that is the whole question of the compensation that has been offered by the Claims Conference to Jews of North Africa who were displaced as a result of the Nazi domination of the area. And that has become also an important part of the family research that we're requested to do. The public interest in genealogical research is as strong as ever. For a host of reasons, including that of compensation, of course, the public continues to request genealogical material endlessly. You too, of course, are invited to enter our website to learn more about the Family Research Department and, of course, to fill in the forms and send requests. Okay, another field of interest, the issue of the financial compensation of the survivors of the Holocaust or the descendants of victims for property and other possessions that once belonged to them is a huge issue which is also reflected in the material held at the archives. With regard to material on land bought in Palestine who later perished in the Holocaust, the CZA holds the archives of, for instance, the Palestine Land Development Company, the company that dealt with what we in Israel call the redemption of the land, the purchase of land from the Arab population, and the selling of it to Jews in the diaspora. Obviously, with the outbreak of the war, contact with the purchasers was lost, and in the 50s and 60s, this land, some of it not entirely paid for, was resold to a third party. Just as an example, only a week ago, there was an article in the Israeli papers regarding a lawsuit presented by the Company for the Location and Restitution of Holocaust Victims' Assets to the Jerusalem Regional Court, demanding compensation from the Palestine Land Development Company for land in Afula bought from the company by Jews of Lodz who perished in the Holocaust. Okay, and here we have a list of the documents, actually, in the files of the Palestine Land Development. No, sorry, that's the Anglo-Palestine Bank, L51, the Anglo-Palestine Bank. A lot of material relating to the purchase of property by people who did not survive the Holocaust. Okay, that was purchase in Palestine of material. We also have a number of record groups or material that relates to the compensation for property and possession in Europe. Okay. As early as 1946, the Jewish National Fund, of all bodies, provided legal help to survivors and the relatives of victims to present claims against Germany and other European countries for private property once owned in these countries. The JNF, Keren Kayemet, would manage the claim, the realization of the value of the property and its transfer to the owners, and that in exchange for a not-so-small fee. The Jewish National Fund's Department for Jewish Property in the Diaspora was set up in 1947 and dealt with thousands of claims. These files are also held at the Zionist archives. Later on, in the 1960s, it was decided that the JNF would deal with the claims from Israel against the Swiss banks. We've heard a lot about this. Itamar Levin's in-depth research into the topic is well known. I'll leave it at that. The CZA holds about 3,000 files of the Section for Jewish Property in the Diaspora, material of enormous value for the ongoing discussions on compensation for Jewish property and possessions lost in the Holocaust. Okay, as you can see, this is one of the documents of the Jewish National Fund office that was set up. As you can see, there are vast amounts of material relating to Holocaust topics held at the CZA, and I've only been able to show a very, very small percentage of the holdings. All I can suggest is that you take a look at our website to get a sense of the material, and then come and visit sometime in order to take a look. I do want to conclude by noting various kinds of memory, notions of memory that we throw about in our discussions. There's cultural memory, commemoration, national memory, nostalgia, post-memory, that's an interesting one, traditions, and so on. The foundation of all of these is archival material. Web technologies have changed the way we diffuse and present archival material, and as such have become a central part of that memory formation. I would like to suggest, though, that the basis is the archival material. There is, I'd like to suggest, an additional type of memory, archival memory.
Thank you very much, and I would open the floor for questions or discussions. Any remarks? Michael. Michael.
Thank you for three very interesting papers, presentations. I have two questions. One is for Jonathan, and that relates to the YIVO sociological methods, about which I do not know much, but it seemed to me that the way you described it, it was more focused on what I would call ethnography, or which apparently is related to sociology, but I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the other sociological methods that YIVO was actually using. And perhaps, if I may, another question for Ben, and it would be these reports that the Wiener and the Wiener Library have been collecting, like the Kristallnacht reports or and the other reports, and the way they were compiling them and publishing them. Has this been compared in any way or systematically compared to other similar non-Jewish efforts? What I have on mind, and I think it would be interesting, for instance, to compare it to the exiled social democracy, German social democracy, the SOPADE reports, the so-called Deutschlandberichte, that I think if you would look at them in terms of content, method, distribution, etc., then I think it could be quite interesting.
Shall I answer? The sociological method that was employed by YIVO extended in many directions. One of it, of course, was ethnography, that began really with Ansky's expedition and the recording of testimony of people in the shtetl, the collecting of various aspects of material culture as well as literary culture. But as YIVO developed, it became something else as well, which was an investigation of contemporary attitudes among Jewish youth. And so in 1935, for instance, YIVO sponsored an extremely important project in autobiography. And we have in the YIVO Institute a substantial collection of autobiographies of Jewish youth throughout Eastern Europe. Some of these autobiographies are by Zionists, some are communists, some are atheists, some are religious. And the purpose of this also was not simply to acquire these materials, but it was from the standpoint of Max Weinreich, who instigated this, to understand, first of all, what the problems of Jewish youth were. And not just economic problems, but psychological problems, spiritual problems, problems with their families, problems in thinking about their Jewishness. as a means of helping the YIVO Institute develop programs that would address them, because he was acutely aware of the need for saving Jewish youth at that time. This led, for instance, or was funneled into the same impulse that led him in, I think, also the late 1930s to translate Freud's General Introduction to Psychoanalysis into Yiddish, because he wanted to find a way of approaching these current conditions of Jewish youth and the larger community as well, psychologically, in addition to economically. It led, this same impulse led to his efforts in collaborating with the Bund in developing social self-help activities of various sorts. And so it extended beyond collecting of ethnographic materials into an attempt, and of course it was cut short in YIVO and Vilna by the war, but an attempt at addressing the real-time problems of the youth and of the continuity of Jewish community. I would say that this directly fed into the data collection efforts of scholars who found themselves in the ghettos, particularly the Warsaw Ghetto, the Lodz Ghetto, and the Vilna Ghetto. Much of what we know of that ghetto experience was collected by YIVO scholars such as Emanuel Ringelblum and Hermann Kruk and Zelkovich in Lodz. So that in the end, this collection activity led also to some of the very first documentation of the Holocaust, which we have in the YIVO Institute and which has now been shared with all of the Holocaust institutions in the world, including, of course, Yad Vashem.
Short answer is, I don't know. Don't know the answer to your question.
To Jonathan, you mentioned YIVO's year of foundation, 1925, as a non-Zionist initiative. The same year, the Hebrew University was opened in Jerusalem.
Yes.
Can you speak a little bit about the relation between these two efforts, or was there a competition? Or I would think that this is part of the politics of YIVO.
Yeah, I think they are certainly connected. They were not connected directly, but they were connected in spirit. As far as I know, there may be someone here who knows more of the historical background of it, but certainly they were part of the same effort at establishing scholarly enterprises to study the history of Judaism for the purpose, again, not just in the abstract, but for the purpose of preserving the people. There was, I believe, the idea that YIVO would be the institution for the Jewish diaspora. We were, and in effect still are, the institution of the diaspora, as it now exists for the most part in the United States, whereas the Hebrew University would be at what many people thought would be, in effect, the spiritual home for the Jewish religion and perhaps the Jewish nation.
I also have a question to Ben. Can I have another one? Yeah. How did you decide what materials to transfer what materials from London to Tel Aviv? Why are there two Wiener libraries today?
Why are there two Wiener libraries? It was a complicated process. I think there was a certain amount of cheating involved. So the initial idea or the assumption on the part of Tel Aviv University was that they would get everything, and that the Wiener Library in London would cease to exist. But the collection in London did contain quite a lot of materials that were not its own property, but were on deposit with us, so they couldn't go. And in a sort of similar way to something you spoke about last night, there were a certain amount of documentation that was taken home by people and then discovered later. But the library would have closed down at that point had it not been for funding coming forward from the Volkswagen Stiftung in Germany and the Endowment for the Humanities in America, which allowed them to microfilm pretty much everything that was then transferred to the university in Tel Aviv. And in many cases that, I think, has served us better than the Wiener Library in Tel Aviv. For instance, press cuttings where they hold original copies that are so fragile that they can't really be handled, whereas we have the microfilms which are robust. So it was a delicate situation at times, and the relationship between the two institutions was fairly uncomfortable for a long time, although now there are no problems, but also we're not able to work collaboratively with them very much. We suggested to them a few years ago a joint exhibition, for instance, that would show there and then come to London, but they said their materials couldn't leave Israel.
Just a short additional question. In looking or in preparing this conference, I found out that the Wiener Library has a digital copy in Budapest of the Open Society archive.
No. They may be. There is a digital. There's a digital collection called Testaments to the Holocaust, which is held in various places, but this is a commercial product.
I just wanted to make a comment about the YIVO and its relationship with the Hebrew University. In the 20s and 30s, it was a very complicated issue. One of the crown jewels of the Yiddish educational system in Poland was the Realgymnasium in Vilna. And it was the only Yiddish high school in Poland. Warsaw, with 6 times as many Jews, could not support a Yiddish high school. Vilna did. Its graduates went to Belgium, France, universities all over the world. There was only one university in the world that refused to recognize the diplomas of the Realgymnasium, and guess which university it was. Max Weinreich, Selig Kalmanovich, Salman Razin, the heads of the YIVO, found themselves in a very tough position because they were constantly being pushed by the Bund and by the leftists and by the left labor Zionists to politicize the YIVO, to turn the YIVO into an institution for the Jewish working class. And Max Weinreich said, the YIVO serves the Jewish people, but it'll serve the Jewish people better as a scholarly institution and not as a political institution. And one of the demands that put Weinreich and the YIVO in a terrible position was that they demanded that the YIVO join the Bund's, join the campaign against the persecution of Yiddish in Israel by the Yishuv, by elements of the Yishuv. And the YIVO was very, very hesitant to be politicized. So eventually the relationship worked itself out, easier after the war than before the war, but at first it wasn't easy.
I have a short question for Rochelle. You mentioned before that the Zionist archives required the Archive of the World Jewish Congress, and I wonder if the archive is still buying up archive material from all over the world, or from institutions as well as from individuals?
You mean, is the material piling up overseas or at the various... Yes, presumably. I should mention that the American World Jewish Congress material is not at the Zionist archives, it's in Cincinnati. That's the first thing. And secondly, yes, the question of the continuing of the relationship between the World Jewish Congress and the Zionist archives is something that we have to deal with in the next coming years, the next few years, in order to absorb or not absorb the material of the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, because I was talking about material relating to up till about the 60s, early 70s. It's something we still have to work out, but we do not have the recent material, with the exception of the Geneva office, which we received recently. We received additional material. But the contact has to be deepened and decisions have to be made.
Thank you all for these presentations. I wonder if you could briefly, it's a big topic, but briefly, to the way that you understand that it pertains, speak about the difference in conception and assembling an archive of testimony from wartime to post-war, from wartime to post-war. How did, if you can say in a nutshell, how did the conception and purposes change? Thanks.
Well, YIVO did not stop collecting during wartime, but obviously its emphasis changed from the sorts of purposes that it had before the war into one of recording this great catastrophe, and it was many YIVO trained scholars were involved, as I said before, in the Warsaw Ghetto, in the Lodz Ghetto, in the Vilna Ghetto, in saving materials, and so on and so forth. After the war, YIVO workers were equally avid in collecting testimony. As early as 1944, they were collecting the testimony of survivors. We felt at YIVO that this testimony was of tremendous importance. It recorded the real experiences of the real people. And so we have one of the largest collections, or we have a very, very large collection of this, as well as other artifacts from the ghettos. At the conclusion of the war in 1945 and the influx of survivors into the United States, there were several agencies, such as the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society and others in New York City that processed emigres, and YIVO came into possession of these archives as well. So we have many, many hundreds of thousands of documents of emigres to the United States. Personal files, people like Henry Kissinger, and we have material about the Wiesel family. And a few years ago discovered that we have the letters between Otto Frank and Nathan Strauss in Frank's desperate effort at getting his family out. So obviously the nature of the YIVO Institute changed radically after the war.
But what I was after was not descriptive as much as conceptual. From the way you're describing, that there was a seamlessness, meaning we did it here, we're doing it now there. And the activity is certainly admirable and to be celebrated. But did the conception of what one was doing with gathering testimony change from wartime to post-war?
Well, obviously it did, because YIVO, as the institution of the European diaspora, was now an institution of a people that had been destroyed. And so the whole effort of YIVO now was reclamation of a past that was gone, as opposed to building a future in Europe. I think that's the fundamental difference.
Yeah, in terms of the Wiener Library, and again, there was no collecting during the war. What was the motivation for collecting those 350 accounts in 1938 and 39 is not recorded anywhere. I suspect those papers were left in Amsterdam when the library moved and were then lost and destroyed. After the war, there are a number of sort of clues about what they thought they were doing, and most of them are to do with wanting to contribute to the shaping of post-war Europe. So Wiener and someone like Caesar Ahrens felt they saw themselves very much as wanting to collect this kind of material in order that those testimonies should, in some sense, be a voice in the political debate about how Europe should develop.
Rochelle? No.
No, we don't deal with testimonies.
Yep. Microphone's on.
This is in fact the short answer to your question. It was not YIVO, I think, to be a partner of the Hebrew University, but the institution which was established 3 years later, the Institute for Judaic Studies, and the main Judaic library by the Great Synagogue in Warsaw, which were really aimed at collaboration with the Hebrew University in Jerusalem.
Okay, last question.
Allow me to extend the Holocaust way up to 1914 and ask about the fate of Ansky's collections, which, as far as I know, did not become a part of YIVO, but since he collected much earlier and had been dead when YIVO was founded already for a couple of years, they became part of Ukrainian and Russian collections. Is anybody here who has been using these collections lately so that he could give us or she could give us more information than which has been found, can be found on the internet, which is not much at all? Thank you.
You're quite right. Ansky collected in 1913, 1914. Excuse me?
In the 90s already and in the 80s.
Well, yeah.
Made audio recordings, the first audio recording of Yiddish texts and songs, which is extraordinary.
Yes.
And some of this might still be found, and films also, in Ukrainian.
Oh yes, they are, in the Vernansky Library in Kiev. And there are other materials in St. Petersburg. The YIVO Institute, although it was founded in 25 and Ansky died in 1920, became the beneficiary of the fact that an Ansky society was started in Vilna that had some of these materials. So in fact, in New York, we do have a small but important set of materials connected to the Ansky archive, which also includes, I should say, fragments of the original manuscript of the Dybbuk. But we do not have ourselves the original sound recordings or much of the material culture that was collected. That is, as far as I understand, to be found in the Vernadsky Library. And if you would like more information about that, please do let me know, because a member of the staff at YIVO, Lyudmila Sholokhova, was formerly the chief music archivist of the Vernadsky Library, and so she understands this collection very well.
Thank you. So I close the floor, thanking lecturers. And I think I do act in the spirit of the next chair, Eleonora, that we start at 11:40. There's a short coffee break, and you will meet again at 11:40 here for early testimonies. The coffee is outside to the right, to your